So a couple of things. Joe's boss, Michael Kratsios, was supposed to be here, and he had some things come up, some very legitimate reasons, and we're very pleased that you could step in for him. Joe, as a White House fellow and a member of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, has some very specific policy areas that he's responsible for. And so I am not going to ask him to speak for the Trump administration about anything beyond those policy areas. And so I just wanted you to know that and for you to know
Absolutely,
that.
I appreciate it.
Great. So, and I also want to tell you, as Jen mentioned, Joe is an active duty Air Force officer and a policymaker in the White House. So there's a lot of jargon that comes up in his conversations, and I have encouraged him to use that jargon, but to explain it to us.
Absolutely.
So, Joe, start off by telling everybody just a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I started as a techie. So I was computer science at Stanford, and then I worked in Silicon Valley for a couple of years for a company called AOL in the old Netscape building, actually. And I was a software engineer there. Worked on a lot of emerging technologies back in the 2005-2007 timeframe, and was really looking for an opportunity to serve our country, to work on policy at the government level, and ended up leaving Silicon Valley to join the Air Force. And so I've spent the last 10, 11 years in the Air Force as a pilot. I fly the C-17, which is a large cargo airplane. We fly all over the world, including combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. And fortunately, this year I was given a very excellent opportunity to serve in the White House on in the Office of Science and Tech Policy. And my policy area kind of borrows from both my tech experience and from my experience as a pilot in the Air Force. And so I lead our advanced transportation portfolio, which includes unmanned aircraft systems, UAS, automated vehicles, supersonics, and then this concept of urban air mobility, which is really what does the future of transportation in large cities look like.
Great. So UAS, unmanned aircraft systems, is the policy area that you've described as being the furthest along. So tell everybody what the White House is doing by way of talking about what this is going to look like, what drones are going to look like in the United States.
Absolutely. So drones, I've been in aviation for a long time, and watching the drone industry explode has really been mind-boggling, honestly, the speed at which that's happening. And so around 2016 timeframe, regulators at the FAA were thinking through, like, how are we going to enable operations of these types of vehicles in our national airspace system with other traffic, over congested areas, et cetera. And I think as they were working through that, they kind of realized that, well, we don't really have any data that would speak to, well, how safe are these? What type of performance characteristics do they have? Can they safely fly over large populated areas? TBD on that. And so we kind of were thinking through, well, how can we get data? But more importantly, how can we get data with a local context, right? So flying a drone in San Francisco is really just a different operation than doing so in the rural parts of Oklahoma. And so regulators at the FAA are not necessarily equipped to make all of those decisions to affect all of those different parts of the country. And so we created this pilot program called the UAS Integration Pilot Program, or IPP as we call it. And the idea was really just to use public-private partnerships between state, local, and tribal governments with private industry to work through some of the different drone use cases in various communities across the country. So we have 9 participants of that program, and they're exploring use cases from pipeline inspections to delivery of medical devices, law enforcement uses, and the whole point and idea of the program is taking the data from those various localities and then bringing it back to the FAA so that we can make rules that are applicable to these aircraft.
When you say participants, these are companies or entities or locations or what?
So it's a government entity. It could be a city. Choctaw Nation is one of them. The city of San Diego is another one, and they are partnered with a private company that has a particular use case that would be relevant to that area, and they can explore different parts of the policy areas in the different cities. And so it was a competitive process to select all of those. That was managed mostly by the Department of Transportation and the FAA. But we're about a year into that program, and we've already seen an explosion in terms of the number, different types of use cases, and the FAA has made some movement on regulatory action as a result of this program. Just recently, about 2 months ago, we released a notice of proposed rulemaking on UAS operations over people and at night. So prior to this rule, and as it sits today, since it's only a proposed rule, those operations are prohibited unless accepted by the FAA. And the FAA would award exceptions in some circumstances, but the majority of the waiver applications that the FAA would get were for over people and at night. And so by proposing a rule that would normalize those operations, we're now freeing up FAA resources to work through more complicated use cases like, well, what about beyond visual line of sight? So right now, flying a drone is like flying a kite. You can't legally operate it if you can't see it. However, the FAA is now looking through or working through waivers and authorizations to allow that beyond visual line of sight to happen.
Joe, excuse me, let me interrupt you. That's
sure.
very interesting. You're saying that all drone flight that the operator cannot see is currently illegal.
So unless accepted by the FAA.
And have those exceptions already been issued?
They have been issued in some cases. And so, when the FAA considers whether or not we're going to accept a rule, there's a lot of information and data that the vendors need to provide to really allow the FAA to accept some level of risk in there. So for beyond visual line of sight, there was a period of time, some of the waivers that were approved required chase planes. So in order to fly your drone beyond visual line of sight, you had to have a manned aircraft flying with it. That's not the most economical approach, I would say. But when it comes to safety, everything in airspace under most circumstances is see and avoid.
Excuse me, my hunch is that hobbyists are violating this law every day. Is that a correct assumption?
I think that's a fair assumption, and so I'd say we bin that into you have the the criminal and then the negligent. And I think most of the concern that we have right now is really around the negligent. And so that kind of maybe takes me to the point of counter UAS, which is another policy issue that we're working from the White House as well. In the last FAA reauthorization bill of 2018, we lobbied very hard to get additional authorities for Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security to be able to identify, track, detect, and in some cases mitigate drones that are operating in areas that they're not supposed to be operating. Previously, only DoD and the Department of Energy had those authorities. And so Congress worked with us, and that's what we arrived at. But moving forward, we don't necessarily see a federal response every time a drone is flying somewhere where it's not supposed to be. So we would like to see that expanded to state and local as well.
It's pretty interesting. You're talking about an area where the law currently is not sufficient, in your opinion, because the law didn't anticipate this. Can you talk a little? Well, first I want to ask you, just put on your pilot's hat for a moment. How concerned are you as a pilot about drones? I think your policy outlook is about how do we make this work commercially, and it's a great, exciting new field. I think that's what the White House wants to promote. Right. But how concerned are you as a pilot?
As a pilot, honestly, I'm not that concerned. If you think of the types of operations that I would do as an air carrier or a large aircraft pilot, most drones, the FAA ceiling is 400 feet for drones, so drones don't operate above 400, at least small UAS don't operate above 400 feet. And 400 feet for a large airplane like the C-17 is, we're going to land in about 5 seconds. So I'm not concerned, but with that being said, this is definitely something that we need to work towards. And I'll bring up another kind of a policy thing that we're working on, and that's the concept of remote ID. So right now, I could download an app on my phone, point it at the sky, and I could see all of the air traffic that's flying around in the sky, and I could say that's Southwest Airlines flight number X, United Airlines flight number Y. Can't really do that with drones right now because they don't emit. They're not required to have transponders. They aren't required to report their position. And as you can understand, that produces a little bit of a security concern from the government side, but also from the traffic management side. What happens when there's a lot of these things flying around and we don't want them all hitting each other? And so remote ID is what we view as the foundation of enabling this new industry.
I assume remote ID is something the FAA can do through a rulemaking?
That's exactly right, and they've been working on it. The current public estimated release date for that is by the end of the year.
Interesting. Can you talk briefly about one of the companies that participated in this pilot program, and also is the White House involved in the global conversation? You know, Mojo, who's seated over there, talked about Zipline, which is doing some things in Africa, blood delivery by drone, but also in the United States, I think.
So I would probably avoid talking about any specific company or endorsing any specific action there. But what I would say is that each locality is working through very different use cases. So I was just out at Oklahoma at a drone conference that they had there with Michael Kratsios, my boss, and the use case that they were working on there was baiting feral hog traps. And so that was Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma is a IPP partner. They were working with a consulting firm that provides, manages, and packages the drones and operates them in a way that gets at this problem. And I wasn't aware that that was an issue that drones would be able to address. But we watched a demonstration. The drone flew in. There was a very it could be either geotagged or I think they were using QR codes to identify the drop zone when we went out there and looked at it. And just like as advertised, it drops a bunch of feed into the hog trap. And so I think that just really goes to how interesting, exciting, and honestly successful this program is, because it's getting folks to work through use cases that none of us would have imagined.
That's neat. You've put that in the Who Knew category, right? In the Who Knew folder.
Absolutely.
Another policy you're working on really surprised me, because it was sort of in the back of my consciousness that we're still interested in commercial applications of supersonic transports. SST, the Concorde went out of production and commercial flight many years ago now.
Absolutely.
Why now SSTs?
So it's really honestly the industry has kind of spurned this new renewed interest in SSTs. So there's a lot of companies that are working on this right now. Boom Aerospace, Ariane, Lockheed just got in, and they're also working on the X-59 demonstrator with NASA. And so industry came to us, and they have a renewed use case, business case for how these jets are going to be successful. Obviously, for Concorde, there's a lot of issues with Concorde in terms of noise, pollution, cost, and the business case didn't really close. And I would argue that in today's society, airplanes like Concorde with that noise level, that level of pollutants, probably would not be accepted by most communities. And so the industry now is taking another look at it with the benefit of almost 50 years of research and development in the subsonic category that have made engines more efficient, noise standards more stringent. And so that's kind of what I would say started this. And our view isn't to decide winners and losers in terms of is this going to be a successful new area. It's more to enable testing, and then market conditions are going to dictate that.
But you have a policy viewpoint. The White House is taking the time to work on this. So the viewpoint is, we think this would be a good thing for it to come back in a commercial sense.
Absolutely, and a good thing for it to come back in a commercial sense, but also, aviation. When you think of R&D in aviation, research and development in one particular area has a lot of applications in other areas as well. Mm-hmm. And so we would expect that spurning, getting more research and development going on in the supersonic space is actually going to help the aeronautics industry as a whole, and might even open our horizons in terms of what is the realm of possible for the future of transportation. I
know you said you fly transports for the Air Force. Have you ever flown faster than the speed of sound?
Yeah, so the C-17, we don't fly supersonic intentionally, so no.
Would you like to?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Not in the C-17, though.
Yeah, I understand.
Maybe in another airplane.
You want to fly in a plane that's built to fly supersonic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Real quickly before we go to questions, or you used the expression earlier, urban air mobility. I think that means air taxis. Companies like Uber have been are developing this. What is the White House doing? Is this a real thing, or is it science fiction?
So I would answer very quickly. It is very real, and it is coming. I think of small UAS as phase one, and there's multiple subphases with small UAS that we need to get through in order to get to a success there. But in terms of what's next, I'm thinking larger UAS, passenger carrying, cargo carrying, and that really gets into the realm of the vehicles that Uber and others are working on. So, but our view is more of it's an ecosystem, right? So when you think of urban air mobility, it's not just the airplane. So electric vertical takeoff and landing is the predominant airplane type that is being considered for this new area. But there's additional infrastructure that comes with that. You know, if it's going to be urban air mobility, where are these things going to land? Some of them, I've met with a number of the companies that are in this space, and this was interesting. One of them told me that these vehicles, when they go to recharge, is roughly draw the current of an average grocery store. And infrastructure, you know, may not be able to support just plugging in a grocery store, and that's something that we need to think about. And so we are very active in this space. We're working on the small UAS first. NASA has a urban air mobility grand challenge that they're working, and we've been working with them on that project. And you know, I wouldn't say that we're going to be seeing this this year or next year, but I think it is definitely on the horizon.
And I don't ask this in sort of a popular political sense, but in a scientific and policy sense. Will the standard for these things, to the extent that they're carrying people, be the same standard that the FAA currently has for airplanes of safety, the safety?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's to be honest, you know, I have a lot of companies from Silicon Valley that come with very lean teams that are working on these vehicles, and they come and they ask, well, how can we get these flying? And the very first question I have for them is, well, have you talked with the FAA, and are you familiar with the FAA certification process? Our view is that the existing FAA certification process under Part 23 is sufficient to address a lot of the new categories of airplanes that we're seeing. And you know, this is where I would probably lean on the community for a little bit of help. You know, I left private sector to come work in the government. And I think we need, in some of these areas, we need more folks with government experience working with private sector companies to kind of help understand the realities when it comes to aircraft certification, operations certification. With that being said, we can get there. Probably something I'm really excited about was Google's Wing, which is essentially a package delivery element of the IPP. They're going to start doing operations in Virginia. They received a Part 135 operations certification, which basically means that they are a small air taxi carrier, and they comply with the same requirements that not necessarily SkyWest, since that's Part 121, but small air taxi. If I'm going to go to Las Vegas and if I'm going to fly a tour helicopter, that would be a Part 135 operation. And there's training requirements for pilots, there's maintenance requirements for airplanes, and through working with the FAA, they got there on the certificate. So we're super excited about that.
Pretty interesting. We have time for a couple questions, please. So if there are none, the one thing we haven't talked about is autonomous vehicles. This is a huge policy area and of huge interest in Silicon Valley. You don't, in talking about what you pay attention to, you don't lead with that. Why?
So autonomous vehicles, I think, are a little bit more complicated. So when we think about the aviation issue, for example, the way the FAA likes to couch regulation is we think about the airmen, we think about the airspace, and we think about the aircraft, right? And we have to come up with rules that address all three of those things. In the autonomous vehicle space, so with aviation, that's all controlled by the FAA, so that makes it easy for them, relatively. And then in the autonomous vehicle space, some of those elements are all controlled by different state, local entities. So, for example, airmen, driver's licenses for operators are issued by states. The vehicle is NHTSA, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. And then the airspace, which I would equate to roads, different players there, state, local, and federal. And so I think it's a little bit more complicated, and for that reason, I think we need to do a little bit more research before we just integrate automated vehicles into our road systems, much like we're doing with UAS. And so DOT, Department of Transportation, has been taking the lead on this. They released AV Principles 3.0, which built on 2.0, which was really just kind of framing the discussion in terms of safety. And it's really, in AV 3.0, they call for for NHTSA, which is largely responsible for certifying these types of vehicles, to think through how are we going to have to change our certification framework for these to work. And I'll use an example. A vehicle, according to NHTSA, has to have a steering wheel in order to be a vehicle on the roads. That may not necessarily be the case if there's not a person that needs to manipulate the steering wheel. But the way that NHTSA has written the rules traditionally, that's been the way it's been. The FAA has taken a more performance-based approach. So when I went out to NASA to fly the X-59 simulator, the airplane has no front windscreen at all. It's just LCD screens that are tied to cameras. And that's kind of the difference between performance-based and then specification. So instead of saying an aircraft must have a windscreen, maybe it should be how the pilot must be able to see unobstructed out the front of the airplane, which could be done by cameras.
Joe, it's interesting that you portray a policy situation where drones are less complicated from a policy perspective, autonomous vehicles are more complicated. Is there a sense in your office that maybe one thing the White House could do would be to try to make autonomous vehicle policy regulation less complicated? Yes,
and so we're working through what our policy options would be in that space. It obviously requires coordination with a number of different entities, both in the White House, state, local, and otherwise. National legislation on AVs at some point in the future, I wouldn't rule that out. Because when you think about it, we really have to herd all of these cats into one kind of unified strategy. And that's gonna take some work on our end.
Please, we have time for a quick question, quick
Sure.
answer.
Great. Thank you. Yes. You talked about urban air mobility, and that drones are generally under 400 feet. You've got the future of taxis in the air. How do you envision some type of air control system as we look at traffic patterns in the urban mobility space? Is that something you're envisioning?
Absolutely, and we refer to that as UTM. So in the UAS space, it's UAS traffic management. When it comes to UAS, that depends very heavily on the remote ID technology that I mentioned earlier. But when we start thinking about larger airplanes that are now mixing in with commercial air traffic, helicopter traffic, things of that nature, we're going to have to think about, well, what does UTM look like in that case? And so we're hoping we can get it right for small UAS first, and then we'll tackle that problem next.
Joe, before you go, your prediction, what will we see in the United States first, commercial SSTs or level 5 autonomous vehicles?
Definitely commercial SSTs.
Commercial SSTs before that. Joe Van Valen, thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you.
Pleasure to have you.
Cheers.
Thank you.